11 years, I've been the memorial lamplighter for Calvary Hollow, Oregon. Population 912, down from a peak of 1,400 in the 80s. Every night at dusk, I drive a 12-mile loop through town and light 47 memorial lanterns mounted on iron posts along the roadways, each one bearing a brass plaque with the name of a deceased resident. The town council installed the system in 2004 as a permanent tribute to every citizen who passed while living within borough limits. I know every name on every plaque. I've polished most of them with my own hands. 3 months ago, the automated inventory system that tracks our memorial registry added 4 new names to the queue. I printed the work order. I recognized the names. All 4 people are still alive. My name is Gavin Torrance. I turned 46 in March, and I've held the title of municipal lamplighter since I was 35, though nobody in town uses that word. They call me the lighter, or sometimes just Gavin with the truck. The position came to me through an odd chain of custody. The previous lamplighter was a man named Del Creighton, who held the job for 19 years before his knees gave out, and he moved to a care facility in Medford. Before Del, a woman named Pat Sheehan did it for 11 years. Before Pat, the lanterns didn't exist. The whole system was her idea originally. She proposed it to the town council after her son drowned in the Rogue River in 2002, and the council approved the memorial network 2 years later. 47 iron posts, each one topped with a gas-fed lantern behind tempered glass, each mounted with a brass plaque bearing a name and 2 dates: birth, death. The lanterns are real flame, not electric, not solar. Actual propane-fed flame behind a glass housing, fed by a small pressurized canister that I replace every 72 hours. The town chose real fire on purpose. Pat Sheehan insisted. She told the council that electric light was utility, but real flame was witness. That phrase is still in the original proposal document. I've read it. I keep a copy in my glove compartment, though I couldn't tell you exactly why. My route starts at the northern edge of town, where Calvary Hollow Road crosses the old timber bridge over Dalton Creek. The first memorial belongs to Margaret Koss, born 1921, died 1997. She was a school teacher. The plaque is clean because I scrub it every second Tuesday, and the lantern sits high on a post wrapped in Virginia creeper that I trim back every spring. I park the truck, climb the 3 steps of the portable ladder, open the glass housing, check the propane level, and strike the igniter. The flame catches. It always catches. Propane is reliable that way. The whole process takes about 90 seconds per lantern, plus driving time between them. And on a clear night, I finish the full loop in just under 3 hours. On rainy nights, it takes longer because the igniters sometimes need a second strike. And I have to wipe the glass down after closing the housing to make sure the flame is visible from the road. I do this every single night, 365 days a year. No holidays, no sick days. The dead don't take nights off, and neither do I. That's not policy. It's just something Del told me during my first week, and I never questioned it. The pay is modest. $14 an hour, no benefits, classified as part-time municipal contract labor, even though the hours are full-time by any honest measure. I supplement with handyman work during the day. Gutter cleaning, fence repair, minor plumbing. Calvary Hollow's the kind of town where everyone knows who to call for what, and I'm the one you call when something small is broken, and you don't want to drive 40 minutes to Grants Pass for a contractor. It's a living, barely. My ex-wife Stacy used to say I chose a career in stubbornness, and she wasn't wrong. The memorial registry is managed through a software system called Civic Trace. The town purchased a license in 2016, part of a broader push to digitize municipal records after the old filing cabinets in the town hall basement flooded during a storm. Civic Trace handles a lot of things. zoning permits, water billing, code enforcement logs, meeting minutes. The Memorial module is just one feature. It maintains a database of all registered memorial plaques, including the name, date of birth, date of death, GPS coordinates of the lantern post, installation date, and maintenance history. When a resident of Calvary Hollow dies, the funeral home files a death certificate with the county. The county clerk's office enters it into the state system. Civic Trace pulls from that state feed every 72 hours. If a new death is registered to an address within Calvary Hollow borough limits, the system generates a work order in my queue. Fabricate plaque, install post, add to nightly route. It's clean. It's orderly. In 11 years, it has never made a mistake. The morning it changed was a Tuesday in February. Cold, about 38 degrees, frost on the grass. I was sitting in the small office the town lets me use in the back of the public works garage, drinking coffee from a thermos and checking my maintenance log on the Civic Trace terminal. The system had flagged a batch update overnight. 4 new entries in the memorial queue. I opened the queue. 4 names, 4 work orders, 4 plaques to fabricate, 4 posts to install, 4 new stops on my nightly route. The names were Leonard Mosley, Ruth Ann Carver, Dennis Packard, and Irene Soule. I knew all 4 of them. Leonard runs the bait shop on Route 7. Ruth Ann works the register at Sheldon's Hardware. Dennis teaches 8th grade science at the middle school. Irene lives alone on Beckett Lane and walks her dog past my house every morning at 7:15. I stared at the screen for a long time. The coffee in my thermos went cold. The cursor blinked inside the first work order, waiting for me to click Accept and begin the fabrication process. All 4 entries listed a date of death, February 11th, the day before. All 4 listed the same cause code. The code was one I'd never seen. Where the system usually displayed a standardized category like natural causes or accidental or undetermined, these 4 entries showed only a numeric string, 00-7714-NC. I closed the queue. I drove to Sheldon's Hardware. Ruth Ann Carver was standing behind the register, alive, sorting a box of wood screws into the divided tray on the counter. She looked up when I walked in and smiled the same way she always does, a little tired, a little warm. "Morning, Gavin. Need something?" I stood in the doorway for 5 or 6 seconds without answering. The bell above the door was still ringing from when I pushed it open. Ruth Ann tilted her head to one side, the way people do when they're about to ask if you're feeling all right. "Just browsing," I said. I walked down the plumbing aisle, pretended to examine a package of pipe fittings, and left. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with the engine off. The heater ticked as it cooled. I could see Ruth Ann through the front window back to sorting screws, and I watched her for probably 3 minutes before I put the truck in gear and drove to the bait shop. Leonard Mosley was at the bait shop, alive, tying a knot in fishing line with his thick, weathered fingers, his reading glasses pushed down to the tip of his nose. He didn't even look up when the door chimed. He just said, "Be with you in a sec," and kept working the knot. His hands were steady. His breathing was audible in the quiet of the shop, slow and regular, the breathing of a man who has done the same thing in the same place for 30 years and sees no reason to rush. I drove to the middle school. Through the narrow window in the classroom door, I could see Dennis Packard standing at the whiteboard, drawing a diagram of the water cycle. He was gesturing with the marker in his right hand, and 3 students in the front row were actually paying attention, which is more than most 8th grade science teachers can claim. He looked healthy. He looked normal. I didn't check on Irene Soule. Not that morning. I couldn't explain why, except that the thought of driving past her house and seeing her walking her dog felt like it would confirm something I wasn't ready to have confirmed. If all 4 were alive, then the system was wrong. If the system was wrong, then it was a glitch. Glitches happen. I'd report it. The county IT contractor would look into it, and the entries would be purged. I drove back to the Public Works garage. I logged into Civic Trace. The 4 entries were still there. I clicked on Leonard Mosley's work order and hit the reject button, which is supposed to send the entry back to the county clerk's office with a note requesting verification. The system accepted the rejection. The progress bar filled. The screen refreshed. Leonard Mosley's entry was back in the queue. Active, unchanged. I rejected it again. Same result. It cycled back into the queue within 30 seconds, as though the rejection command had never been sent. I tried Ruth Ann Carver's entry. Same thing. Dennis Packard. Same thing. Irene Soule. Same thing. 4 rejections, 4 instant returns. I called the county clerk's office in Grants Pass. A woman named Sandra picked up. I told her I was the Calvary Hollow lamplighter, and that Civic Trace had generated 4 memorial work orders for people who were still alive. Sandra typed for a while. She asked me to spell the names. I spelled them. She typed some more. "I'm not showing those entries on our end," she said. "They're in my queue right now, 4 of them, all dated February 11. Mr. Torrance, I'm looking at the Calvary Hollow feed. The last death certificate we processed for your borough was in October. Gerald Hass, age 81, natural causes. There's nothing since then. Then where are these work orders coming from?" Sandra was quiet for a moment. I could hear her scrolling through something. "The entries might have been generated locally. Does anyone else have admin access to your Civic Trace terminal?" Nobody did. The town manager, Bill Evers, had a login, but he'd told me years ago that he never used it. The system was my responsibility. I thanked Sandra. I hung up. I sat in the cold office and stared at the 4 names on the screen. February turned into a particularly harsh stretch that year. The frost didn't lift for weeks. Ice formed on the lantern housings, and I had to carry a heat gun on my nightly rounds to thaw the glass before I could open it. The routine absorbed me. 47 lanterns, 3 hours every single night. The physicality of the work helped. Climbing the ladder, checking propane, striking the igniter, wiping the glass. My hands stayed busy. My mind could idle. But the 4 names stayed in the queue. Every morning when I checked the terminal, they were there. I stopped trying to reject them. The system wouldn't let them go. They sat in the queue like patient guests waiting to be seated, and every morning their date of death remained February 11th, and every morning the cause code read 00-7714-NC. I did what any rational person would do. I ignored them. I told myself the county IT contractor would come through on a routine maintenance cycle and flush the bad data. I told myself software had glitches. I told myself that Civic Trace was 10 years old and running on a server in a closet in Town Hall, and that stranger things had happened to older systems. 2 weeks passed. Then something changed, not in the software, in the town. Ruth Ann Carver stopped coming to work at Sheldon's Hardware. I noticed because I stopped by on a Thursday to pick up a box of roofing nails, and a kid I didn't recognize was behind the register. I asked where Ruth Ann was. The kid shrugged. "Called in, I think. Mr. Sheldon didn't say." I bought the nails. I drove past Ruth Ann's house on Fieldstone Drive. Her car was in the driveway. The curtains on the front window were closed, which was unusual. Ruth Ann kept those curtains open. She had a ceramic cat collection on the windowsill that she liked people to see. The curtains had been closed for at least a few days, based on the way the fabric had settled flat against the glass. No wrinkles from recent handling. The following Monday, I drove past again. Curtains still closed, car still in the driveway. No lights visible inside, not even the blue flicker of a television. I parked across the street and sat there for 10 minutes. The house was silent, not quiet. Silent. There is a difference. A quiet house still produces ambient noise. The refrigerator compressor kicks in. The heating system ticks. A clock somewhere marks seconds. A silent house produces nothing. It absorbs sound the way dark fabric absorbs light, and what comes back is less than what went in. I didn't knock on her door. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself she was probably visiting family out of state. I told myself the closed curtains meant nothing. But when I logged into Civic Trace that night before starting my route, Ruth Ann Carver's entry had changed. The status column, which had read pending fabrication for 2 weeks, now read ready for installation. The system had auto-advanced her work order to the next stage. The GPS coordinates for her memorial post were already assigned. The location was on Fieldstone Drive, 40 feet from her front door. I printed the work order. My hands were shaking, but only a little. The kind of shaking you can hide if you keep your fingers moving. The work order included a field I'd never seen before. Below the standard information, below the name and the dates and the GPS coordinates and the cause code, there was a new line. It read, transition status, graduated. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what any of it meant. But I folded the printout and put it in my jacket pocket, and I drove my route that night the way I always do, starting at Margaret Coss on the Timber Bridge and working south through town, lighting each lantern with the same practiced motions I've repeated over 4,000 times. When I reached the stretch of road along Fieldstone Drive, I slowed the truck. I looked at Ruth Ann's house as I passed. The windows were dark. The curtains were closed. The car was in the driveway, and on the shoulder of the road, exactly where the GPS coordinates indicated, there was a new iron post. It hadn't been there that morning. I would have seen it. I drive this road twice a day. The post was black iron, identical to the other 47, sunk into the frozen ground with a concrete base. The glass housing at the top was empty, waiting for a propane canister. The brass plaque was already mounted. I stopped the truck. I left the engine running and the headlights on. I walked to the post. The brass was bright and new, not yet weathered. The engraving was sharp and clean. Ruth Ann Carver, born April 9th, 1971. Died February 11th, 2025. The February air tasted like metal. The truck's headlights threw my shadow long across the frozen grass, stretching it toward Ruth Ann's dark house. I stood there reading the plaque over and over, as though repetition might change the words. It didn't. The dates didn't waver. The name didn't rearrange itself into someone I didn't know. I touched the plaque with my bare hand. The brass was warm, not from the headlights, not from residual heat. The metal was warm the way living skin is warm, and when I pulled my hand away, my palm was tingling, the sensation you get when blood returns to a limb. It's been compressed too long. I got back in the truck. I drove the rest of my route. I lit every lantern. When I got home at 11:40 that night, I sat at my kitchen table and unfolded the work order printout and stared at it under the overhead light. The paper smelled faintly of something I couldn't place, sweet and organic, like soil after warm rain, except it was February and the ground was frozen. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and listened to the house, and the house was not silent. The refrigerator hummed. The heating ducts ticked. The clock in the hallway marked seconds. My house was still a house that made sounds, and I was grateful for every one of them. The next morning, I went back to Fieldstone Drive. The post was still there. In daylight, it looked exactly like all the others. Same iron, same design, same mounting hardware. I checked the concrete base. It was fully cured, which should take at least 24 hours in warm conditions. In February cold, it should take days. The base was smooth and hard, as though it had been in the ground for months. I walked to Ruth Ann's front door. I knocked. The sound was flat and shallow, the way a knock sounds on a door when there's nothing behind it to bounce the sound back. No furniture, no walls of hanging pictures, no human mass absorbing and reflecting the vibration. Nobody answered. I knocked again. I waited 2 full minutes. Nothing. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The door swung inward, and the air that came out was warm and motionless and carried the same sweet, organic smell from the printout. The house was empty. Not abandoned. Empty. The furniture was gone. The ceramic cats were gone. The curtains I'd seen from outside were still hanging, but behind them the rooms were bare, clean. The carpet showed no indentations where furniture legs had pressed. The kitchen counter held nothing. The refrigerator door was open, the interior dark and dry and smelling of nothing at all. Ruth Ann Carver's house looked like a house that had never been lived in. Every surface was clean. Every room was bare. The air was still and warm and sweet, and the longer I stood in the entryway, the more the warmth felt intentional, like the house was maintaining a temperature for a purpose I couldn't identify. I left. I pulled the door shut behind me. It locked on its own. I heard the deadbolt slide home from the inside, a heavy metallic sound that carried clearly in the frozen air. The door had been unlocked when I arrived. Now it was locked, and I was outside, and the mechanism had engaged by itself. I stood on Ruth Ann's porch and looked at the new memorial post on the road. The brass plaque caught the gray morning light and threw it back at me, warm and bright. That evening, before my route, I checked Civic Trace. Ruth Ann Carver's status had changed again. It now read, active, awaiting illumination. The system was waiting for me to light her lantern. I didn't light it. Not that night. I drove past the post on Fieldstone Drive with my eyes fixed on the road ahead, and I kept my speed steady, and I didn't stop. The empty glass housing sat on top of that iron post, like an eye socket waiting for its eye, and I could feel it watching the truck pass the way. You feel a conversation you're deliberately not having. The weight of the unspoken thing filling the cab. I lit the other 47, everyone. Margaret Koss on the bridge, Earl Redmond on the curve past the Methodist Church. Susan and Harold Fenn, side by side, at the intersection of Main and Depot. Married 52 years, died 9 days apart. I knew them all. I had lit them all thousands of times. The routine was a rope I held in the dark, and that night I gripped it with both hands. When I got home, I pulled up the Civic Trace terminal on my personal laptop. The town had given me remote access years ago so I could log maintenance notes from home. Ruth Ann's entry still read active, awaiting illumination. The other 3, Leonard Mosley, Dennis Packard, and Irene Soule, still read ready for installation. Their GPS coordinates were assigned, but their posts hadn't appeared yet, or I hadn't driven past their assigned locations yet to check. The thought made my stomach tighten. Maybe the posts were already there. Maybe they'd been there since the work orders advanced. Standing in the dark along roads I hadn't driven that day, brass plaques shining with names of people who were still walking and breathing and going about their lives. The following morning, I drove to each of the 3 locations the system had designated. Leonard Mosley's coordinates placed his post on Route 7, about 200 yards south of his bait shop. Nothing was there yet. The shoulder was bare, the frozen weeds undisturbed. Dennis Packard's coordinates pointed to Sawyer Street, across from the middle school parking lot, also bare. Irene Soule's coordinates mapped to the intersection of Beckett Lane and Old Orchard Road, 50 feet from her mailbox. The ground was empty. The relief I felt was physical. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched. No posts, no plaques, just frozen ground and dead grass and the ordinary ugliness of a small town in February. The system had generated the coordinates, but whatever mechanism was installing the posts hadn't reached them yet. Ruth Ann's was the only one that had materialized, and Ruth Ann was the only one whose status had advanced to awaiting illumination. I clung to the logic of it. If the posts appeared in sequence, and if the sequence followed the software status progression, Then the others wouldn't appear until their entries advanced. And maybe they wouldn't advance. Maybe Ruth Ann's was an isolated event, a single corruption in the data that had propagated into the physical world through some process I couldn't understand, but that might still be containable. I decided to call Bill Evers. Bill was the town manager, had been for 8 years, a decent man, cautious, a kind of administrator who preferred problems that fit inside spreadsheets. I caught him at his desk at Town Hall and told him about the 4 entries. I left out the part about Ruth Ann's empty house. I left out the part about the post appearing overnight. I just told him the software had generated work orders for living residents and that I couldn't reject them from the queue. Bill was quiet for a few seconds. I could hear him tapping a pen against his desk. A rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap. "Have you contacted the Civic Trace vendor?" he asked. I called the county clerk. They don't show the entries on their end. The data didn't come from the state death certificate feed. So it's a local error. That's what I thought, but I can't delete them. The system won't let me reject them. More pen tapping. I'll put in a ticket with the vendor. Might take a week or 2. Their support queue is backed up. Budget cuts at the county level hit their staffing. Bill, these are real people's names, living people. The system is listing them as dead. I understand that, Gavin. It's a database error. It's unsettling, but it's a database error. Don't fabricate any plaques. Don't install any posts. Just skip those entries and run your normal route until the vendor gets back to us. I told him I would. I didn't tell him that the system had already installed a post on its own, because I knew how that sentence would sound. I thanked him and hung up, and sat in the Public Works garage listening to the compressor cycle on and off, and I thought about Ruth Ann's house. The bare floors, the warm, still air, the deadbolt sliding home from inside an empty building. That night, I drove my route. When I reached Fieldstone Drive, the post was still there. The glass housing was still empty. The brass plaque still read Ruth Ann Carver, and the date of death was still February 11th. I slowed the truck, but I didn't stop. The post stood in my headlights, and as I passed, the empty glass housing caught the beam and refracted it, throwing a brief, pale circle of light against the wall of Ruth Ann's dark house. The light touched the closed curtains and held there for a second, and then I was past, and the house fell back into shadow. 3 nights I did this. 3 nights I drove past that post without stopping. 3 nights, the system's status for Ruth Ann Carver read active, awaiting illumination. The words didn't change, they didn't escalate. They just waited, patient and precise. The way an institutional system waits for a task to be completed before advancing to the next stage. On the 4th night, I found a note in the Public Works garage. It was on the workbench where I keep my tool bag and propane canisters, folded once, written on lined yellow legal paper in a hand I didn't recognize. The handwriting was careful and even, neither masculine nor feminine, the kind of penmanship that belongs to someone who was taught to write by strict nuns or demanding school teachers in a decade when that still mattered. The note read, "The lanterns are not decorative. They are functional. An unlit memorial is an incomplete transition. Do not leave her in the corridor. The corridor is not a place of rest. No signature, no date, no header or letterhead. Just those 4 sentences in that careful, even hand on a yellow legal paper that smelled like the inside of a filing cabinet. Old paper, stored paper, paper that had been waiting inside something for a long time before being placed on my workbench. I checked the garage. The door had been locked when I arrived. My key was the only copy that wasn't in Bill Evers' desk drawer, and Bill's office was locked at night. The windows were sealed and hadn't been opened. The dust on the sills was undisturbed. Nobody had entered the garage through any opening I could identify, and yet the note was there, centered on my workbench, positioned exactly where I would see it. I read it again. Do not leave her in the corridor. The word corridor did something to the air in the garage. Not a temperature change, not a sound. A density shift. The air became heavier, as though the word itself had mass, and the garage walls felt closer than they should have. I folded the note and put it in my jacket pocket with the work order printout, and I left the garage faster than I usually do. That night I stopped at Ruth Ann's post. I sat in the truck with the engine running and the heater blowing, and the headlights illuminating the iron post and the empty glass housing. I had a fresh propane canister in the passenger seat. I had my igniter in my pocket. The process would take 90 seconds. Open the housing, seat the canister, check the valve, strike the igniter, close the housing, wipe the glass. 90 seconds and Ruth Ann Carver's memorial lantern would be lit, and the system would advance her status to whatever came after awaiting illumination. I sat there for 40 minutes. The truck's fuel gauge dropped a visible notch. My hands were on the steering wheel, and they were not shaking. That was the strange part. The fear I'd expected wasn't there. What was there instead was something closer to professional obligation. The feeling you get when a task is overdue and the delay is causing problems you can sense but not measure. The note had called the unlit state a corridor. It had said the corridor was not a place of rest. Whether I believed it literally or not, the phrasing had landed in a part of my brain that processes duty, not belief. I got out of the truck. I took the propane canister. I climbed the portable ladder. The glass housing opened on its hinge the way all the others do. I seated the canister, opened the valve, and struck the igniter. The flame caught on the first strike. It burned steady and warm behind the tempered glass, the same amber flame as every other lantern on my route. But when the light reached full brightness, something happened to the house behind me. Not a sound, not a movement, a change in pressure. The air between the lantern and Ruth Ann's house compressed and released, like a single, massive breath drawn and expelled, and the closed curtains on the front window moved, not from wind, from inside. They swelled outward against the glass for one full second as though the house had inhaled, and then they settled flat again. I didn't turn around to look directly. I saw it in my peripheral vision, reflected in the curved glass of the lantern housing as I wiped it down. The curtains swelling, the house breathing, then stillness. I climbed down the ladder. I walked to the truck. I put the ladder in the bed and the igniter in my pocket. I drove to the next lantern on my route. The process continued. The routine held. When I got home and checked Civic Trace, Ruth Ann Carver's status had changed. It no longer read awaiting illumination. It now read illuminated, transition complete. Below that, in a field I'd never seen on any entry in 11 years of lamplighting, was a single line. "Thank you, Mr. Torrance." The system knew my name. Of course it knew my name. I was the logged-in user. My credentials were attached to every maintenance action I'd ever performed. There was nothing supernatural about software displaying the name of the user who completed a task. But the phrasing wasn't system-generated. Civic Trace used standardized language. Task completed by user ID GT-2014. That was the format. Impersonal, bureaucratic, clean. It didn't say thank you. It didn't use honorifics. It didn't address the user as a person. I logged out. I closed the laptop. I went to the kitchen and poured myself 2 fingers of the bourbon I keep above the refrigerator for the nights when the wind is bad and the house feels too large. The bourbon was Evan Williams, nothing special, and it burned in a familiar, grounding way. I drank it standing at the kitchen counter, staring at the window above the sink, which showed me my own reflection and nothing beyond it. The night was dark. The glass was cold. My reflection looked tired and older than 46, and its eyes were asking questions that its mouth would never form. The next morning, I drove to Fieldstone Drive. I wanted to check on the lantern, make sure the flame was still burning, Make sure the canister seal hadn't leaked overnight. Standard maintenance. The flame was burning. Steady, amber, clean. The plaque was bright in the morning light. Ruth Ann Carver. Born April 9th, 1971. Died February 11th, 2025. The house had changed. The curtains were open. Behind the glass, the rooms were no longer empty. I could see furniture, a couch, a lamp, a bookshelf against the far wall. The ceramic cats were back on the windowsill, lined up in their usual order. The tabby first, then the calico, then the Siamese, then the fat orange one she'd bought at a craft fair in Ashland. Everything was back. Everything was in its place. The house looked lived in. It looked loved. But through the window, I could see that no one was inside. The rooms were furnished and warm and complete, and they were empty. The house had restored itself, or been restored, to its full state, and then its occupant had not returned. The house was a memorial now. The furniture was a memory. The ceramic cats were headstones. I sat on the porch steps. The wood was cold. My breath made small clouds that dissolved before they reached the railing. I could hear the lantern behind me, the faint hiss of propane-feeding flame. And beneath that, something else. A hum. Low and constant and patient. The frequency of a machine that has been running for a long time and expects to run for a long time more. The hum was coming from the post, from the iron, from the ground beneath the concrete base. It traveled up through the frozen earth and into the soles of my boots and through the bones of my feet and into my spine, where it settled and waited, carrying information I couldn't decode. I went home. I checked Civic Trace. Leonard Mosley's status had advanced. It now read, "Ready for installation." By the time I drove to Route 7 that afternoon, his post was already in the ground. Black iron, tempered glass, brass plaque. Leonard Mosley. Born September 22nd, 1958. Died February 11th, 2025. The concrete base was fully cured. The housing was empty, waiting for propane. Waiting for me. I drove to the bait shop. The door was locked. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Closed until further notice." The lights were off. I cupped my hands against the glass and looked inside. The bait tanks were empty. The fishing rods that usually stood in the rack behind the counter were gone. The cash register was closed and dark. The shop looked like it had been closed for weeks, not hours. I didn't try the door. I didn't check his house. I already knew what I'd find. An empty building, warm, still air, the smell of soil after rain, a deadbolt that locks from inside with no one inside to lock it. Instead, I drove to the middle school. Through the narrow window in the classroom door, I could see Dennis Packard's 8th grade science class. The substitute teacher was at the whiteboard, young, nervous, drawing a diagram that didn't look like anything in particular. The students were restless. One of them had his head on the desk. Dennis Packard was not there. I found the school secretary in the front office, Mrs. Kimball. She'd been at that desk since before I graduated from the same school 28 years ago. "Dennis Packard," I said. "Is he out today?" Mrs. Kimball looked at me over her glasses. Her expression was the kind that holds information it doesn't intend to release. "He hasn't been in since last week," she said. "We've been calling. No answer. Has anyone gone to his house? Principal Aldrich drove by Monday, said the lights were off and the car was in the driveway. Left a note on the door." She paused. "Are you a relative?" "No, just a neighbor." She nodded in the way people nod when they've decided to stop asking questions. I thanked her and left. On the way out, I passed the substitute teacher in the hallway. She was carrying a stack of photocopied worksheets and looking at the ceiling as though trying to locate a leak that no one else had mentioned. Her eyes were wide and glassy with the particular overwhelm of someone placed inside a system they were not trained to navigate. I checked Civic Trace from my truck. Dennis Packard status, ready for installation. Irene Soul's status, pending fabrication. The progression was staggered, one at a time. Ruth Ann first, then Leonard, then Dennis, then Irene. As though the system was processing them in order, managing its workload, maintaining quality control over a production line that fabricated memorials for the living. That night, I lit Leonard Mosley's lantern. I didn't wait 4 days this time. The note had said the corridor was not a place of rest, and whatever the corridor was, I didn't want Leonard Mosley in it any longer than necessary. The flame caught on the first strike. The hiss of propane was steady and warm. The brass plaque reflected the firelight back at me, turning the letters gold. When the flame reached full brightness, I heard the same pressure shift I'd heard at Ruth Ann's. A single drawn breath from the direction of the bait shop 200 yards up the road. A compression and release. A house-sized lung filling and emptying once. I wiped the glass. I climbed down the ladder. I drove on. The next morning, I checked Civic Trace. Leonard Mosley. Illuminated. Transition complete. Below that. Thank you, Mr. Torrance. Dennis Packard's status had advanced to ready for installation. I was being paced. The system was feeding me one name at a time, waiting for me to complete each task before advancing the next. It was using me. My hands, my propane, my igniter, my nightly rote. The memorials couldn't complete themselves. They needed a lamplighter. They needed the specific ritual of a human being climbing a ladder and opening a glass housing and striking a flame. The system could generate the data and install the posts and engrave the plaques, but it could not light the fire. That part required me. The realization didn't arrive with dread. It arrived with the quiet clarity of understanding a job description you've held for years but never fully read. I was not a municipal laborer maintaining decorative infrastructure. I was a functionary in a process that converted living residents into memorial flames. The lamplighter position wasn't a job. It was an office, an appointed role within a system much older and much larger than a 10-year-old software license and 47 iron posts. Del Creighton, 19 years in this position. Pat Sheehan before him, 11 years. Pat Sheehan, who proposed the memorial network after her son drowned, who insisted on real flame, who said electric light was utility, but real flame was witness. Pat Sheehan hadn't created the memorial system. She'd formalized something that already existed. She'd given it posts and plaques and propane and a municipal budget line. But the thing underneath, the mechanism that selected names and managed transitions, had been here before her. It had been waiting for infrastructure, for someone to build it a body. I found Pat Sheehan's phone number in the old contacts binder in the public works garage. She lived in Coos Bay now, retired. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon. The phone rang 6 times before she answered. Her voice was careful and measured, the voice of a woman who had spent years choosing her words with precision. Mrs. Sheehan, my name is Gavin Torrance. I'm the lamplighter in Calvary Hollow. Silence, then softly. I wondered when you'd call. Mrs. Sheehan, the system is adding names, people who are still alive. The posts are appearing on their own, and when I light them, the people are gone. Their houses go empty. Their lives just stop. She didn't respond right away. I could hear her breathing, slow, deliberate breathing. The kind that people use when they're managing pain or managing the decision about how much truth to release into a conversation. How many, she asked. 4, 2 already lit, 2 in process. 4. She repeated the number the way you repeat a medical result that confirms what you already suspected. Not surprise, confirmation. It was 2 for me, in the first year. Then none for almost a decade. Then 3 in a single month, right before I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't do it? Wouldn't. Chose not to. I trained Del Creighton, and I handed him the keys, and I moved to the coast, and I haven't been back. A pause. I want to tell you I don't regret it, but I'd be lying. I think about those lanterns every single night. Every night at dusk, my body knows. My hands want to hold the igniter. My feet want to climb the ladder. The work doesn't let go of you, Mr. Torrance. It nests inside your muscles. I was standing in my kitchen, leaning against the counter with the phone pressed to my ear. The bourbon bottle was on the counter. I hadn't poured any. The afternoon light through the window was thin and gray, the particular gray of late February in southern Oregon, when the sky can't commit to rain or sun and settles for something that resembles neither. Who built it? I asked. The system. The real system, not the software, not the posts. The thing underneath that chooses the names. Pat Sheehan exhaled. I didn't build it. I want you to understand that. What I built was the visible layer. The posts, the plaques, the lanterns, the municipal budget allocation. I built the body, but the thing that lives inside the body was already here when I arrived. What is it? I don't have a name for it. I've never had a name for it. Dell called it the registry, but that was his word, not mine. What I can tell you is that Calvary Hollow sits on something. Not a burial ground, not a fault line, not any of the things you'd expect me to say. The town sits on a threshold, a boundary between states. When someone in Calvary Hollow is approaching a transition, the threshold knows before anyone else does. Before the doctors, before the family, before the person themselves. It knows and it prepares. A transition. You mean death. I mean a change of state. I don't know what's on the other side of it, Mr. Torrance. I've never crossed. But I know that without the lanterns, the crossing is incomplete. The people who die without a lit memorial, they don't arrive. They stay in the corridor, the space between. I've felt it. The corridor is cold and formless, and it doesn't end. It's not punishment. It's not purgatory. It's just absence. Permanent, conscious absence. The lantern is the marker. The flame is the door. Without it, there is no door, and the dead walk a hallway with no rooms. My mouth was dry. I opened the cabinet and took down a glass and filled it from the tap. The water tasted like pipes and chlorine and the mineral signature of the aquifer that feeds Calvary Hollow's municipal supply. Ordinary water, grounding water. I drank the whole glass. Your son, I said. The drowning? That's how you found out. The silence that followed was long enough that I checked the phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. It was. Pat Sheehan was still there. Her breathing had changed, shallower now, constricted. The breathing of someone whose chest has tightened around a memory they carry everywhere. Tommy drowned in the Rogue River on August 14, 2002, she said. He was 19, strong swimmer. The current took him under a log jam, and by the time the rescue divers reached him, he'd been submerged for 40 minutes. They pronounced him at the scene. She stopped. I waited. The kitchen faucet dripped once. At a night, I couldn't sleep. I walked into town at 3 a.m, and I ended up at the spot on Dalton Creek where Tommy used to fish as a boy, the timber bridge. And standing on that bridge in the dark, I felt him. Not his ghost, not his memory. Him, his actual presence, disoriented and afraid, moving through something that had no shape and no end. He was lost, Mr. Torrance. My son was dead, and he was lost, and there was no light to guide him anywhere. Her voice had steadied. The pain was still there, but it had been compressed into something structural, something load-bearing. She'd built her life around it the way a tree grows around a fence wire. I lit a candle on the bridge railing, just a dollar store votive in a glass jar. I lit it, and the feeling changed. Tommy's presence shifted, moved, oriented. The flame gave him a direction, and then he was gone. Not gone like erased, gone like arrived. The fear I'd felt from him dissolved, and what replaced it was something I can only describe as warmth without temperature, peace without stillness. He was somewhere, and the somewhere was better than the corridor. And that's when you proposed the memorial system to the town council. Not right away. I spent 2 years studying it, walking the town at night, finding the places where the threshold was thin, some spots you could feel it just by standing still, the bridge, the curve past the Methodist church, the intersection of Main and Depot, places where people had died over the decades and no one had lit anything for them. I could feel the corridor at those spots, the residue of incomplete crossings, people stuck in transit because no one had opened the door. The 47 posts, I said. They're not random. Every post marks a thin spot. Every lantern sits exactly where the threshold is close enough to breach with fire. The GPS coordinates in Civic Trace aren't assigned by software. They're mapped to the topology of the threshold itself. I surveyed them by hand, walked every road in Calvary Hollow with a candle, and where the flame bent toward the ground without wind, I marked the spot. I set the glass down on the counter. The bottom of the glass made a small click against the laminate. The sound was ordinary. Everything in my kitchen was ordinary. The magnets on the refrigerator, the utility bills held under them, the clock on the wall marking time in its reliable, mechanical way. All of it ordinary, and none of it sufficient to counterbalance what Pat Sheehan was telling me. The names, I said. The 4 names the system added. Are these people dead? Not yet. Not in the way you mean. The threshold has identified them. They're in pre-transition. The system is preparing their infrastructure before the physical event occurs. By the time you see the post in the ground, the person is already in the corridor. Their body may still be walking around, but their crossing has begun. The body is the last part to stop. Ruth Ann Carver is dead? Ruth Ann Carver is in transit. When you lit her lantern, you opened the door. She moved through. The body and the house and everything she owned followed, because those things were part of her, and the transition is total. Nothing gets left behind. That's why the house is furnished again. The furniture went with her. What you're seeing through the window is an echo, a receipt. I thought about the ceramic cats on the windowsill. The tabby first, then the calico. I thought about Leonard Mosley tying that fishing knot with steady fingers. I thought about Dennis Packard drawing the water cycle on the whiteboard while 3 students actually listened. I thought about Irene Soule walking her dog past my house every morning at 7:15, her thin frame bundled in a green wool coat that she'd been wearing since at least 2018. How do I stop it? I asked. Pat Sheehan was quiet for 3 beats. You don't. There has to be a way. If I refuse to light the lanterns, if I leave the posts empty, then they stay in the corridor, conscious, afraid, alone, for as long as the threshold exists, which is longer than Calvary Hollow, longer than Oregon, longer than anything you or I can measure. You can refuse to light the lanterns, Mr. Torrance. Dell almost did. He went 3 weeks once without lighting a new memorial. And by the end of those 3 weeks, he couldn't sleep because he could hear them. Not with his ears, in his spine, in his molars. The corridor residents vibrate at a frequency that human bone conducts. If you've ever felt a hum coming up through the ground and into your skeleton, that's them. That's the people waiting for a door. I had felt it. On Ruth Ann's porch. The low, constant hum traveling up through the frozen earth and into the soles of my boots. I'd felt it, and I'd called it a machine. I'd told myself it was mechanical, infrastructure, pipes or power lines or some buried utility resonating in the cold. What about the note? I said. Someone left a note in my garage, on the yellow legal paper, said not to leave her in the corridor. Dell left notes for himself, reminders. He was meticulous about it. Yellow legal pads, always. He kept them in the filing cabinet in the garage. When he transitioned out of the position, he took most of them with him, but some stayed. The system holds on to documents. It archives everything. If a note was relevant to an active process, the system may have surfaced it. From a filing cabinet onto my workbench. I told you, Mr. Torrance. The visible layer is posts and plaques and software. The layer underneath is something else. It manages its own infrastructure. It files its own paperwork. It has been doing this longer than any of us have been alive. I sat down at the kitchen table. The chair creaked under my weight. The sound was familiar, the same creak it made every morning when I sat down with my coffee, and I was grateful for the creak, the way you're grateful for a handshake from someone you know is real. Del Creighton, I said. He did this for 19 years. How many names did the system add while he was lamplighter? You'd have to ask him. He's at Shady Pines in Medford. Room 14. His knees are bad, but his mind is clear. Clearer than mine most days. She paused. He'll talk to you. He's been waiting for you to come, even if he doesn't know it yet. The lamplighters always find each other eventually. We have to. No one else can carry the weight of it. I thank Pat Sheehan. She told me to take care of myself. She told me to eat regular meals and keep my sleep schedule consistent and not to drink alone. And her voice, when she said those things, carried the practiced concern of someone who had watched a predecessor make every mistake she was warning me against. I promised I would. I hung up. The kitchen was quiet. The clock ticked. The faucet dripped. The light through the window had shifted from gray to the pale gold of a winter afternoon, losing its hold on the sky. I drove to Dennis Packard's assigned location that evening before starting my route. The post was there. Black iron, tempered glass, brass plaque, Dennis Packard. Born June 3rd, 1977. Died February 11th, 2025. The concrete base was cured. The housing was empty. Across the street, the middle school parking lot was vacant, the sodium lights buzzing their flat, orange hum into the dark. The school was closed for the day, the windows black, the flag on the pole hanging limp in windless air. I lit Dennis Packard's lantern. The flame caught on the first strike. The propane hissed its steady warming hiss, and the glass glowed amber. From across the street, from inside the dark school, I heard the pressure shift, the single massive breath. But this time it was different. This time, mixed with the compression and release, I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to architecture or atmosphere. A human sound. A man's voice, very faint, saying a single word. Thanks. Not from the school, not from the lantern. From the brass plaque itself. From the engraved letters of Dennis Packard's name. The word rose from the metal like heat from pavement and dissolved into the February air, and then there was only the hiss of propane and the distant buzz of sodium lights and my own breathing, shallow and ragged and visible in the cold. I wiped the glass. I climbed down the ladder. I drove my route. 49 lanterns now, counting Ruth Ann and Leonard and Dennis. 3 new stops. 3 new flames. The loop took 12 minutes longer than it used to, and when I finished, I sat in my truck in the driveway and stared at my house and tried to remember what it felt like to believe that lighting lanterns was a municipal maintenance task performed for decorative purposes. The memory was already fading. It belonged to a version of myself that had existed 3 weeks ago, and that version was becoming difficult to reach, like a name on the tip of your tongue that retreats the harder you chase it. Irene Soul's entry advanced to ready for installation the next morning. I checked the intersection of Beckett Lane and Old Orchard Road on my way to a handyman job. The post was in the ground. Irene Soul. Born December 1st, 1944. Died February 11th, 2025. 80 years old. The oldest of the 4 by nearly 2 decades. The brass plaque was polished and new, and the empty glass housing sat on top of the iron post, waiting. I didn't light it right away. Not because I was resisting, because I wanted to see Irene Soul one more time. I drove to Beckett Lane. Her house was a small, white Cape Cod with green shutters and a yard that she maintained with the aggressive precision of someone who believes that crabgrass is a personal insult. The yard was still immaculate, even in February. The dead grass was raked clean. The garden beds were mulched. The mailbox post was straight, and the flag was down. Her car was in the driveway, a 1998 Toyota Camry beige with a bumper sticker that read, "My other car is also old." I had seen that bumper sticker every morning for 11 years when she walked past my house with the dog. The dog was a terrier mix named Captain, gray-muzzled and arthritic, who walked with the determined waddle of an animal that has outlived its knees but not its sense of purpose. The front door was closed. The curtains were open. Through the window I could see the living room. Furniture in place. Television on, playing what looked like a daytime talk show. The blue flicker of the screen moving across the walls and ceiling. A mug on the coffee table still steaming. An Afghan draped over the arm of the couch. Everything suggesting occupancy. Everything suggesting a woman who had stepped out of the room for a moment and would return any second. But the house was silent. That same total silence. The silence that absorbs sound instead of producing it. And even though the television was on, even though the mug was steaming, even though every physical detail argued that Irene Soule was alive and home and about to walk back into her living room with a plate of toast, I knew she wasn't. I knew the way you know a phone will ring before it rings. I knew the way you know, at the tail end of a long illness, which visit to the hospital will be the last. The knowing didn't come from evidence. It came from the hum. The same low frequency I'd felt on Ruth Ann's porch, traveling up through the frozen ground and into the bones of my feet. And the hum was louder here, more insistent, carrying a vibration that my skeleton interpreted as urgency. Irene Soule was in the corridor. She'd been there since February 11th. 19 days. Alone in formless absence, waiting for a door that only I could open. I didn't wait until evening. I drove to the intersection, climbed the ladder, loaded the propane canister, and struck the igniter at 2:47 in the afternoon. It was the first time I'd ever lit a memorial in daylight. The flame was harder to see against the pale sky, but it was there, steady and amber behind the glass. The pressure shift came from the direction of Irene's house 2 blocks away. The breath, the compression and release. And beneath it, softer than Dennis Packard's voice, fainter and older, a sound that might have been a sigh, or might have been a word I couldn't quite resolve. The sound a person makes when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and are finally allowed to set it down. I climbed down the ladder. I looked toward Beckett Lane. I couldn't see Irene's house from the intersection, but I could feel the change. The hum in the ground was gone. The frequency that my bones had been conducting had ceased, and what replaced it was ordinary stillness. Dirt and gravel and frozen weeds, the world being only itself. I sat on the bumper of my truck and pressed my palms against my eyes. The inside of my eyelids was red and warm and private, and I stayed there for several minutes, not thinking, not processing, just existing in the darkness behind my own hands. When I opened my eyes, the afternoon had shifted. The light was different, warmer, the pale gold of winter retreating, and for the first time in weeks, the sky had color, not much, just a thin band of blue at the western horizon, visible between the tree line and the cloud cover. But enough to suggest that the season would turn, and the frost would lift, and the days would lengthen, and the work would continue. I checked Civic Trace that evening. All 4 entries read illuminated, transition complete. All 4 thanked me by name. Below the 4th entry, below Irene Soule's completed record, there was a new line I hadn't seen before. A field labeled Q status. It read, empty, monitoring. The system was watching. The threshold was listening. The Q was clear for now, but the word monitoring meant it wouldn't stay clear. Calvary Hollow had 912 living residents, and the system knew every one of them, and somewhere in the mathematics of mortality and threshold proximity, the next name was already forming. Not yet visible, not yet assigned, but present. The way a storm is present on the radar before it reaches the coast. I closed the laptop, I poured the bourbon, I drank it standing at the kitchen counter, and the clock ticked, and the house made its living sounds around me, and I was grateful. 3 weeks passed without a new entry, then 4 weeks, then 6. The queue stayed empty. I drove my route every night, 50 lanterns now, the 4 new ones integrated into the loop, as though they'd always been there. The brass plaques weathered slightly, losing their bright newness, acquiring the same patina as the older memorials. Ruth Ann's Virginia creeper would need trimming come spring. Leonard's post had a slight lean that I'd need to correct with a shim. Dennis's glass housing had developed a hairline crack from a temperature swing. Irene's propane canister drained faster than the others for reasons I couldn't explain, and I had to replace it every 50 hours instead of 72. Maintenance, ordinary, physical, repetitive maintenance. The work my hands knew. The work my muscles performed without consulting my brain. I leaned into it. I let the routine carry me the way a current carries a boat that has stopped paddling. And for 6 weeks, the current was smooth, and the water was calm, and the lanterns burned, and the dead were at rest. Then the system added a 5th name. The name was Gavin Arthur Torrance. Born March 15th, 1979. Died April 3rd, 2025. I was sitting at the Civic Trace terminal in the Public Works garage when the queue updated. It was a Thursday morning, early April, the first week the frost had truly broken. The air outside smelled like wet earth and new grass. The date of death on the screen was 8 days away. My first reaction was laughter. Not real laughter. The involuntary kind. The sound the body makes when the brain receives information it cannot categorize as either tragedy or comedy, and defaults to the noise between. I laughed for about 4 seconds, then I stopped. The garage was quiet. The compressor was off. The fluorescent tube above the workbench buzzed at its constant frequency, and the sound was too similar to the hum I'd felt in the ground beneath the memorial posts, and I reached up and unscrewed the tube until it went dark. I read the entry again. The format was identical to the other 4. Name, date of birth, date of death, cause code 00-7714-N&C, GPS coordinates for the post. The coordinates placed it on Mercer Road, 30 feet from my front porch. Status, pending fabrication. I closed the terminal. I opened it again. The entry was still there. I logged out, cleared the browser cache, restarted the machine, and logged back in. Still there. Gavin Arthur Torrance. The name I sign on tax documents and insurance forms, and the back of the checks the town sends me twice a month for $14 an hour. I drove home. Mercer Road was empty. No post in the ground, no concrete base, no brass plaque bearing my name and 2 dates, one of which hadn't happened yet. The shoulder of the road in front of my house was bare grass and gravel, still damp from the morning, undisturbed. The absence of the post should have been comforting. It wasn't. The absence was temporary. I knew the progression now. Pending fabrication became ready for installation. Ready for installation meant the post would appear. The post would appear, and the glass housing would sit empty on top, and the system would advance my status to active, awaiting illumination. And then what? Who lights the lamplighter's lantern? I called Del Creighton at Shady Pines in Medford. The front desk transferred me to his room. He picked up on the second ring, and his voice was clear and sharp. The voice of a man whose body had failed him, but whose mind was still running at full capacity, like an engine block sitting on a cracked chassis. Mr. Creighton, my name is Gavin Torrance. I'm the lamplighter in Calvary Hollow. I know who you are, son. Pat called me 2 months ago and told me you'd reached out. Been expecting you. The system added my name. Del Creighton was quiet. I could hear the television in his room, low volume, a game show with muffled applause. He muted it. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man choosing between honesty and mercy and realizing they might be the same thing. Date of death, he asked. April 3rd. 8 days from now. Yes. Mine was listed too. Did Pat tell you that? Back in 2013, the system added my name with a date 6 weeks out. Del Raymond Creighton, August 19th. I read it on the terminal and my hands went numb. Not metaphor, Mr. Torrance. Actual numbness. Couldn't feel my fingers for 20 minutes. Sat in that garage and held my hands under hot water until the sensation came back. What happened? I didn't die, obviously. I'm here. 83 years old, and my knees are shot, and I eat pudding for breakfast 3 days a week. But I'm breathing. He paused. The system listed me, and I refused to complete the process. I stopped lighting new memorials. I maintained the existing route, kept the flames burning on the posts already installed, but when the system generated my work order, I rejected it. Same as you tried with those 4 names, and same as you, the rejection bounced back. But you didn't die. No, because the system doesn't kill anyone, Mr. Torrance. The system identifies transitions that are already in progress. The 4 people whose lanterns you lit, they were dying. The threshold detected it before the physical symptoms manifested. Cancer cells dividing in tissue too deep for scan. Aneurysms forming in vessels no doctor was monitoring. Slow, silent biological processes that would have killed them regardless of whether a brass plaque existed with their name on it. The system didn't cause their deaths. It processed them. I was pacing my kitchen. 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back to the table. The rhythm of it matching the rhythm of my heartbeat, which was elevated but steady. The heart rate of a man performing physical labor rather than a man in panic. So I'm dying, I said. Something is happening inside me right now that the threshold can detect and my body can't feel. That's what I thought when my name appeared. I drove to Grants Pass, went to the emergency room. Told them I was having chest pains because I didn't know what else to say. They ran an EKG, blood panels, chest x-ray. Everything clean. They sent me home with a pamphlet about stress management. The next day I drove to Medford and saw my primary care physician. Full physical, clean. The week after that I drove to Portland and paid out of pocket for an MRI and a full body scan at a private imaging center. Clean. Perfectly healthy for a man of 71. No tumors, no blockages, no time bombs ticking inside my anatomy. But the system still listed you. The system listed me. My post appeared on Dalton Road, 200 feet from the Public Works garage. My plaque was engraved and mounted. My glass housing sat empty for 6 weeks, waiting for propane and flame, and I refused. Every night I drove past my own memorial post, and I did not stop. I lit every other lantern on the route, and I skipped mine. And every morning the system status read active, awaiting illumination. And every morning I closed the terminal and went about my day. What happened on August 19th, the date the system listed? Del was quiet again, longer this time. The game show was still muted. I could hear him shifting in what I imagined was a hospital-style bed with adjustable rails, the kind they give you in assisted living when your knees are bad and your balance is worse. Nothing happened, he said. August 19th came and went. I woke up that morning and ate breakfast and drove my route that night and lit every lantern except mine. And when I checked the system the next day, my entry had changed. The date of death was gone. The status read something I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. What did it read? Deferred. Just that one word. And below it, a new line. Q position retained. Lamplighter exemption active. The words hit me with a physical sensation. Not relief, something more complicated. The feeling of being told that the rope you're hanging from is strong enough to hold, but also that you're going to be hanging from it for a long time. Lamplighter exemption, I repeated. The system needs a lamplighter. It cannot complete transitions without one. If the lamplighter enters the queue, the system faces a contradiction. It needs me alive to process my own death, which means it can't process my death while I'm the active lamplighter. As long as I held the position, I was exempt. Deferred. My name stayed in the system, but the date of death cleared, and the post on Dalton Road stayed dark. Never lit, never completed. That's why you retired. Your knees didn't give out. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard on a telephone. My knees are genuinely bad, Del said, and there was something in his voice that might have been shame or might have been the memory of shame, weathered down to its smoothest edges by 10 years of distance. But they weren't bad enough to stop me from climbing a 3-step ladder. I retired because I understood the bargain. As long as I was the lamplighter, I was exempt. But the exemption required me to light every other memorial on the route. Every single one. Every night. No exceptions. No holidays. No sick days. The dead don't take nights off, Mr. Torrance. Del told me that on my first day. I told you, and it's true. But what Del didn't tell me, what I'm telling you now, is that the lamplighter doesn't get nights off either. Not because of policy, because of contract. The exemption is conditional on uninterrupted service. 19 years, I said. You lit lanterns every single night for 19 years without a break. Every single night. Christmas Eve. New Year's. The night my wife Marlene was in the hospital with pneumonia. The night my grandson was born in Eugene, and I wanted to be there more than I'd ever wanted anything. I drove the route instead. 3 hours. 50 lanterns by the time I retired. Every one lit. Every flame confirmed. Because if I missed the night, the exemption lapsed and my entry would reactivate, and the date of death would return, and the system would resume, processing the transition it had detected in my body 10 years earlier. You were a hostage. I was a lamplighter. The job is what it is. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain itself. It offers a single accommodation. You light the dead, and in return, you get to stay alive. The terms are rigid, and the hours are permanent, and the pay is $14 an hour with no benefits. But you get to keep breathing, which is more than the people in the corridor can say. I stopped pacing. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at Mercer Road. The grass on the shoulder was green now, the first real green of spring, tender and bright against the gravel. No iron post. Not yet. The system was still in pending fabrication. I had time. How much time I didn't know, but the post hadn't materialized, and the queue hadn't advanced, and the date on the screen was still 8 days away. Del, I said, when you retired, when you passed the job to me, did the exemption transfer? I didn't know. I hoped it would. The system recognized you as the new lamplighter the moment I removed my credentials, and you entered yours. Your user ID replaced mine on every active record. The exemption should have transferred with the role, but I wasn't certain. I spent the first 6 months in this facility checking my body for symptoms every morning, running my hands over my lymph nodes, pressing my abdomen for lumps, timing my heartbeat with my wristwatch. I did that for 6 months before I stopped. And I only stopped because the checking was making me crazy, and if I was going to die, I'd rather it be a surprise. Are you still in the system? Is your entry still there? I don't know. I don't have access to Civic Trace from here. I don't want access. I've spent 10 years trying to forget the sound of that terminal refreshing, and some mornings I almost manage it. I thank Del Creighton. He told me to eat regular meals and keep my sleep schedule consistent and not to drink alone. The same words Pat Sheehan had used. The same order. The same cadence. As though there was a script for outgoing lamplighters, a set of prescribed parting instructions passed from one to the next, a tradition older than the software and the posts and the brass plaques. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. The afternoon light moved across the floor in the slow, indifferent way that light moves when it has no investment in the human dramas unfolding beneath it. I thought about $14 an hour. I thought about no holidays. I thought about Stacy, my ex-wife, who left because I was married to a job she considered pointless, and who would never know that the job was the only thing keeping me on this side of a threshold she couldn't perceive. April 3rd arrived. I woke at 6. I lay in bed listening to the house. The refrigerator hummed. The heating ducts ticked. The clock in the hallway marked seconds. My body felt the same as it always did. Stiff in the lower back from years of ladder climbing. A twinge in the right knee that flared when the weather changed. The persistent mild headache I attributed to caffeine dependency, and never to anything worse, because worrying about headaches at 46 is a hobby I couldn't afford. I drove to the Public Works garage. I logged into Civic Trace. My entry was there. Gavin Arthur Torrance. Date of death, April 3rd, 2025. Today. Status, ready for installation. I drove to Mercer Road. The post was in the ground. Black iron, tempered glass, brass plaque, my name, my dates. The concrete base was fully cured. The glass housing was empty, waiting. 30 feet from my front porch. Close enough that I would see it every morning when I stepped outside for the newspaper I don't subscribe to, but still check for out of habit because my father did, and some behaviors outlive their purpose. I stood in front of my own memorial. The brass was warm to the touch. The same living warmth I'd felt on Ruth Ann's plaque. My name was engraved in the same clean, precise lettering as all the others, and the dates bracketed my life with the efficiency of a filing system that has already determined where the folder goes. I didn't light it. I went home. I ate breakfast. Scrambled eggs and toast and black coffee. Same as every morning. The eggs were overcooked because I was distracted, and the toast was pale because I pulled it too early, and the coffee was too strong because I'd used an extra scoop without thinking. An imperfect breakfast made by imperfect hands in an imperfect kitchen. And I ate every bite because imperfection is the privilege of the living. That evening I drove my route. 50 lanterns plus my own empty post, which I passed without stopping. The flame I didn't light cast no shadow. The housing sat dark on its iron post, and as I drove past, I felt the hum in the ground. But this time the hum was different. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't insistent. It was patient. The patience of a system that has operated for longer than any single human life and understands that compliance is not a matter of force but of time. I checked the Civic Trace when I got home. My entry had updated. The date of death was gone. The status read, deferred. Queue position retained. Lamplighter exemption active. Below that, service requirement. Uninterrupted nightly illumination of all active memorials. Lapse threshold. 1 missed cycle. 1 missed cycle. 1 night without lighting every lantern. That's the margin. That's the distance between alive and in transit. 24 hours. The length of a bad flu. The length of a flat tire on a mountain road with no cell service. The length of any ordinary human interruption that could prevent me from completing my route. I poured the bourbon. Evan Williams. Nothing special. It burned in its familiar, grounding way. I drank it standing at the counter, looking at my own reflection in the dark kitchen window. The reflection looked tired. 46 years old and tied to a 12-mile loop of iron posts and propane canisters and brass plaques for the rest of whatever my life turns out to be. No vacations, no sick days, no nights where I stay home and watch a movie and fall asleep on the couch like a person whose obligations end when the workday does. I drove to Shady Pines the following weekend. Del Creighton was in room 14, as Pat had said. He was smaller than I'd imagined. Thin, white-haired, sitting in a wheelchair by the window with a crossword puzzle book open on his lap. His eyes were sharp and brown and carried the specific alertness of a man who has spent decades watching for things that other people don't see. "You're still here," he said when I walked in. Not a question. A confirmation. "I'm still here." Then the exemption held. It held. He nodded. He set the crossword book aside. His hands were thin and spotted and steady, the hands of a man who had struck 4,000 igniters on 4,000 nights, and whose muscles still remembered the motion, even though the job was a decade gone. "How many lanterns now?" he asked. 51. The 4 new ones, plus mine. Mine stays dark. Mine's still there, too. Dalton Road. 200 feet from the garage. I assume you pass it every night. I did. I passed Del Creighton's dark memorial post every single night on the first leg of my route, right after Margaret Koss on the bridge. I'd never thought about it. It was just another post, one of several that had been installed before my time and that I'd assumed belonged to residents who died before the lantern system was fully operational. Unlit posts, dark housings. I'd asked Bill Evers about them once, early in my tenure, and he'd waved his hand and said they were decommissioned units, scheduled for removal. They were never removed. They stood in the dark along my route like sentinels guarding an empty hallway, and I'd driven past them 4,000 times without understanding what they were. Deferred posts, lamplighter exemptions, dark memorials for people who were listed and not lit, who remained on this side of the threshold because the system needed them more than it needed to process them. Del's post. And now mine. "How many dark posts are there?" I asked Del. He looked at me. His sharp brown eyes held a calculation I couldn't follow. "In Calvary Hollow, 2, mine and yours?" He paused. "But Calvary Hollow isn't the only town with lanterns, mister. Torrance. It's not the only threshold. It's not the only system. Pat Sheehan didn't invent this. She formalized what she found in one small town in southern Oregon. But the thresholds exist everywhere. In every town that sits on one, there is a lamplighter. In every system, there is a dark post. And every lamplighter drives their route every night without exception, because the margin's the same everywhere. One missed cycle. I sat with Del for an hour. We didn't talk about the system for most of it. We talked about fishing. We talked about the weather in Medford, which was warmer than Calvary Hollow and easier on old bones. We talked about his grandson, who was 9 now and played soccer, and had recently informed Del that he wanted to be an astronaut, which Del considered an excellent career choice for a boy who would never be asked to light lanterns in the dark. When I left, Del called after me from his wheelchair. "Mr. Torrance." I stopped in the doorway. "The first year is the hardest. After that, the route becomes breathing. You don't think about it. You just do it. And some nights, when the air is right and the flames are steady and the brass catches the light in a certain way, you'll feel something from the posts that isn't a hum, something warmer, something that might be gratitude, or might be peace, or it might just be the sound of a door closing gently behind someone who has finally arrived where they're going." He picked up his crossword book. I walked to my truck. The drive back to Calvary Hollow took 45 minutes, and I used every one of them to sit with what I'd learned and what I'd chosen, and what I would continue to choose every night at dusk for the rest of my functional life. That was 3 months ago. The queue has added 2 more names since then. Margaret Yee, 74, a retired postal worker who lived on Aspen Court, and Jim Hollowell, 61, who ran the laundromat on South Main and always smelled like dryer sheets and nickel-plated quarters. I lit their lanterns. The flames caught on the first strike. The pressure shifted. The houses breathed. The corridor opened and closed, and 2 more people crossed through. And the town's population dropped by 2, and no one filed a missing persons report, because the system is thorough and total and leaves no gaps for questions to grow in. 53 lanterns now. My route takes 3 hours and 22 minutes. I start at Margaret Koss on the Timber Bridge, and I work south, and I pass Del Creighton's dark post and my own dark post, and I don't stop at either one. The dark posts are promises. The lit posts are completed transactions. And I am the mechanism that converts one into the other, the human hand that the system cannot replicate, the match head that the threshold requires to open its doors. I eat regular meals. I keep my sleep schedule consistent. I don't drink alone anymore because Pat and Del both told me not to, and their advice carries the weight of earned authority. I maintain the lanterns. I polish the plaques. I trim the Virginia creeper on Margaret Koss's post every spring. I replace Irene Soul's propane canister every 50 hours. I check the hairline crack in Dennis Packard's glass housing and monitor it for expansion. The work is physical and repetitive and grounding, and my hands know every motion. And my muscles carry the memory of 4,000 nights and counting. The Q status reads empty, monitoring. It has read that for 3 weeks. It will change. I know it will change because the system is always watching, always measuring the distance between the living and the threshold, always preparing the next name before the body has begun to feel the first tremor of its own decline. The next name might be someone I know. It might be someone I love. It might be the woman at the gas station who always gives me an extra napkin with my coffee, or the teenager who mows the lawn at the Methodist church, or Bill Evers in his office at Town Hall, tapping his pen in that steady rhythm that sounds too much like a heartbeat for me to hear without flinching. I don't know who the next name will be. I only know that when it appears, I will fabricate the plaque, if the system hasn't already, and I will install the post if the ground hasn't already opened for it, and I will load the propane canister and climb the ladder and strike the igniter. The flame will catch. It always catches. And somewhere in the corridor, a person who has been walking a hallway with no rooms will see a light, and the light will become a door, and the door will open, and they will step through into whatever waits on the other side. I don't know what waits on the other side. I'm the lamplighter. I stand on this side in the cold, with propane on my hands and brass polish under my fingernails, and I open doors I'll never walk through. Not yet. Not as long as the root is driven. Not as long as every flame burns. Every night at dusk, I start at the Timber Bridge. Margaret Koss, born 1921, died 1997. The flame catches. I wipe the glass. I climb down. I drive south. The next lantern waits. The next one always waits. And my dark post stands on Mercer Road, 30 feet from my front porch, unlit and patient, its empty glass housing open to the sky like a mouth that has learned to hold its breath.